Hello there, my name is George English. I'm the Director of Research Through People. So we made this video for those of you who've got ancestors who came from the west of Scotland, either whether you live in Scotland still or whether you've gone to other parts of the world with your ancestors. So let's look at the west of Scotland in a bit more detail, because the important thing about our ancestors, they lived through history, they lived through what happened in the areas where they lived in. The west of Scotland has the feature where you can see Glasgow, there's a very big city which dominates things, and others around Glasgow by and large, which are a fair size, Paisley, Greenock, Kilmarnock and so on. And then it also includes country areas, in particular Argyll, which they talk about the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Well, just look at the number of islands here, Mull, Jura, Islay and so on. So if your ancestors came from that part of the west of Scotland, they lived in a very rural community, whereas of course the industrial cities and so on had much more to offer. And in fact, a very big feature was that word industry, and we'll come to that in the Industrial Revolution. So our ancestors lived through history. Here are the various counties in the west of Scotland. You can see the numbers and so on. Now, what happened in history? Well, the biggest feature, the last 3 centuries typically is where most of the research we do takes place. We can go back in time. But 1707, Scotland joined the Act of Union with England and Wales. And that Act of Union, fairly soon followed by the Industrial Revolution, had a tremendous impact. It meant people tend to leave the rural areas and come to the cities and towns where the new jobs were. The Highland clearances, a period in history up in the Highlands where literally people were cleared off the land and fled to various places. They would have come down to the west of Scotland, as well as going abroad to America and other places. The British Empire developed over the years, and typically a lot of people left not just Scotland but England and other parts, and went to other parts of the world, to America, Australia and so on. That may have occurred for your ancestors, and you may be living there now and want to know more about what it was like for your ancestors back in Scotland. And a particular feature in the middle of the 1800s, there were 5-6 years of potato blight. The people in Ireland, many of them lived literally on this one foodstuff, the potato. The blight for 5-6 years caused tremendous famine, and a lot of people left Ireland, and a lot of them came to the west of Scotland as well as other parts of the world. That may have affected your ancestors. So let's look a bit more detail what happened in Scotland at that time since the 1707 Act of Union. The key thing for Scotland then, it gained them access to the English markets, particularly in America, and there was an immediate economic boom. If you go to Glasgow, they talk about the tobacco lords who profited from the tobacco in America and exporting it. And then immediately after the Act of Union, the Industrial Revolution started and created tremendous change, tremendous jobs as well. And the United Kingdom became the most successful economic union in history. By 1850, the United Kingdom had more than 40% of the world's industrial capacity, and Scotland benefited tremendously from that and contributed as well. And the sort of industries which grew and grew and grew were textiles, shipbuilding, coal, iron and steel, and I mentioned tobacco. And you look at the population, Glasgow became the second city of empire. The population went up by more than 50 times between 1700 and 1900. Other places in west of Scotland, Paisley, 4,000, 72,000. J&P Coats in the early 1900s was the 3rd biggest company in the world. Kilmarnock, another place, almost a village in 1700, expanded greatly. And the main towns, main centres of population in west of Scotland, apart from Glasgow, we've got in Renfrewshire, Paisley and Greenock, and we'll talk about Greenock in a moment. In Ayrshire, Ayr was the town going back centuries. Kilmarnock was one that really grew with the Industrial Revolution. In Lanarkshire, as well as Glasgow, we've got Hamilton and Coatbridge and Stirling. So these are the main centres of population from the past, where your ancestors may have come from. So what we're now going to do is pick 3 examples, just to give you a brief flavour of ancestry, what may apply to your ancestors, living through history. So I mentioned Greenock. Within 5 years of the Act of Union, Greenock had built the harbour and started the shipbuilding industry. So here we have John Brodie. 100 years later, he's born in Greenock. He becomes tied up with that sea growth and so on. He's a master of a steamboat, and he moves nearer the docks, and he's buried in the new cemetery, opened in 1876. So what's happening here? Just little examples here of as things change in Greenock, John Brodie is caught up in that. And we've got here John Rhodes, and I'll explain why we've got the two people in a moment. He's also born, he becomes a seaman too. Now he marries Mary Johnston, and Mary's father was a spirit dealer. Now that's a factor that's going to come in here, because their daughter's born in 1846, Mary Ann. And here we are, one of the things we do with our reports, we bring to life by using old maps. So here's an old map of Greenock. We could see from the census where the Brodies and Rose lived in the various years. So here we are, John Brodie's living in Crawford Street in 1851. John Rhodes is living in Sugar House Lane. Sugar, very important to Greenock. One time there were more than 20 sugar refineries in Greenock because of the trade with the world. John Rhodes moved not very far, did he, to Sir Michael Street. And Mary Ann Brodie, John's daughter, was living in Nicholson Street. Now, we're going to use her as an example. Now, talk about times. She marries Alec Brodie in 1866. Within 2 years, Alex has died of tuberculosis, something we've got rid of a long time ago here, but in the 1800s, a very big factor. 2 years of marriage, loses a husband. She became a spirit merchant, because I mentioned of the connection beforehand. She must have been a really redoubtable character, and she moved to Wellington Street and Brisbane Street. So a little flavour, very quickly we were getting a flavour of what happened to our ancestors, the people that they were, the times they lived through. So let's move north of the River Clyde, which is the one that goes to Glasgow, to Dunbarton. Here are the Moors, and his father comes from Lanarkshire, but his mother, she's come down from Argyllshire. And the Moors go back in Glasgow and Lanarkshire. Now, one thing we can do, we can get old photographs or old pictures. So here we are. Here's a map of Glassford, an old photo of Glassford where they were living. Now, here we have, back to this, what's a key factor we find out reasonably easily from the censuses, what our ancestors did. Now, weaving, textiles are a very big factor. So there we are. James Moore and his father Cunningham Moore were silk weavers. But then really as the Industrial Revolution took place, William Moore the son becomes an engineer. There was far more mechanical things going on because of the Industrial Revolution. So again, our ancestors are caught up with the opportunities presented by the times. And now we get another one, Elizabeth Donald. So she's born in Hamilton, over in Lanarkshire, and her parents are also from Lanarkshire, from near there. But look at this. The O'Donnells, both of them are born in Ireland, as is Patrick Murray, who marries Elizabeth Rafferty, who's born in Renfrewshire. Now, I mentioned earlier the great famine in Ireland, the 1845 to 1852, so a lot of people came over here. This is clearly what has happened here. And we go back in time, and in fact, look, all of the known, in this case, great-grandparents, came from Ireland, and they came over. And let's look at this in a bit more detail. What did they do when they got here? Well, the jobs were, the word jobs, fortunately, because of the Industrial Revolution. But look at this, the O'Donnells, they became coal miners, generation after generation. Patrick McCaffrey, an agricultural labourer. In the 1841 census, agricultural labour was the most common occupation. But as the Industrial Revolution took place, more and more people left the land. And there were Elizabeth Rafferty, a power loom weaver. Typically got hand loom weavers before that sort of time, but in the mid-19th century, things became mechanized, and there's obviously Elizabeth doing that. Now, how do we find out about this? Well, the main source very often is the census. I mentioned the Great Irish Famine in 1845 to 1852. Here are the Murrays in Scotland in 1851. So it's actually during the river, and they're living in Rutherglen in Lanarkshire. And here's Margaret, the mother. She's a widow. And when you look at the ages of the children, Richard's born age 4, so clearly her husband has died 3 or 4 years, in the last 3 or 4 years. We don't know for certain whether that was before they came from Ireland or after. But look at this. There she is living with 11 children. She's age 50. They're all born in Ireland, and clearly they fled from the famine to come over here. And the children have got jobs. And what sort of jobs? So John's a farm labourer, Margaret a pilot, most of them are working in textiles, and James and Patrick, aged 12 and 10, are dye workers. Just look at the social history our ancestors have lived through. And talk about mining, well, here's I think a very interesting painting of miners in Coatbridge. Tremendous number of people mining, and of course coal was so important in driving the machines and the things that happened in the Industrial Revolution. So that may well have been what happened to your ancestors. And that's very much what we're trying to do with these videos, give you a flavour, and then obviously we'd love to look at your ancestors for you and help to bring them to life. We've made other videos that are relevant here. One's about ancestors in Scotland. We've one particularly on Glasgow. And Ayrshire, we picked Ayrshire as such, so if you want to know more or you come from those parts where your ancestors did, please follow up on that. So I hope you found that of interest. There are contact details. We give a free consultation, so what we suggest to you, send us brief details of what you know about your parents, grandparents and so on. There's an email address there and a mobile phone number. We've got various packages we can talk about, but basically what we do is we have a look, we come back to you, and then we discuss the various options so you can make an informed decision of what you would like us to do on your